The moment the police officers arrived, the energy in the terminal shifted. Passengers whispered, cell phones were raised, and a tense hush fell over the crowd. Elijah Carter, a man who had built his empire through unshakable composure, stood motionless. His gaze flicked to the airline staff, who now wore matching expressions of forced neutrality, the kind of look people have when they realize they might have made a terrible mistake. "Sir, we need to speak with you," one officer said, stepping forward with practiced authority. Elijah exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll his shoulders. "About what, exactly?" Rachel, the check-in agent, crossed her arms. "He refused to comply with verification procedures," she said, her voice laced with confidence. Too much confidence. The lead officer gave Elijah a once-over, his brow furrowing slightly as he assessed the tailored navy suit, the polished shoes, the gold cufflink that caught the light just right, all the markers of a man who was far from lost, confused, or out of place. Elijah reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness. With a few taps, he turned the screen around. A Skylink executive's name, number, and an urgent text chain were displayed. "Before you make any decisions," Elijah said, his voice smooth, controlled, "you might want to call the CEO of this airline. She's expecting me." Rachel's smirk faltered. The officer's radio crackled. He turned slightly, speaking in low tones as he relayed the name displayed on Elijah's phone. Seconds later, a response came through. The officer stiffened. A new tension filled the air. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the officer gave her a sharp look, not at Elijah, at her. Elijah didn't need to hear the radio message to know what had just been said. "Sir," the officer said, clearing his throat, "we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. You're free to go." Rachel's face drained of color. Tyler, the younger employee beside her, swallowed hard. Elijah allowed the silence to stretch before finally adjusting his cufflinks. "I know." Then, without another word, he grabbed his boarding pass, lifted his carry-on, and walked toward the security checkpoint. The whispers followed him, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone who had witnessed it. And as Rachel stood frozen behind the counter, still processing the shift in power, she had no idea that 10 minutes from now, in a boardroom high above the terminal, her career would cease to exist. Because when the CEO of Skylink learned what had just happened, her first reaction wasn't just shock, it was fury. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport pulsed with energy, a crossroads of countless journeys converging under one vast steel-ribbed roof. The rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases blended with the murmur of boarding calls, the occasional burst of laughter, and the chatter of impatient travelers pacing near departure gates. Beneath the polished glow of overhead lights, business executives tapped furiously at their phones, parents wrangled restless children, and backpackers studied maps with wide-eyed determination. It was a place of movement, of purpose, of endless transition, a world where no one truly stayed, only passed through. Through the automatic glass doors stepped Elijah Carter, moving with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to command. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that draped effortlessly over his broad shoulders, he carried himself with an air of success not inherited but earned. Every stride was measured, every glance deliberate, his posture exuding the confidence of a man who had built an empire from the ground up. A single gold cufflink gleamed on his wrist, a subtle but intentional statement. Some recognized him instantly. A young black man in a Skylink airline uniform, standing off to the side near the baggage drop, nudged his co-worker. "That's Elijah Carter," he whispered, awe slipping into his voice. "The CEO of Nexus Technologies?" His colleague, a white woman in her early 30s, gave a half glance before shrugging, uninterested. A few other passengers, particularly those in business attire, stole quick, admiring looks, murmuring his name under their breath, recalling articles about his meteoric rise in the tech world. But for every set of eyes that recognized his success, there were others that scrutinized him with quiet skepticism. A middle-aged white couple standing near the first-class check-in counter exchanged a brief look before the woman leaned toward her husband and muttered something under her breath. A man in a tailored gray suit, clearly another executive, eyed Elijah for a moment too long, his expression unreadable before turning away. And then there were those who barely noticed him at all, because to them he was just another traveler, another face in the ever-moving tide of the airport. Elijah barely acknowledged any of it. He had long grown used to the weight of assumptions, the unspoken questions lurking in the glances of strangers. It was a quiet burden he carried, one he had no choice but to bear with dignity. At 42, he had learned that success did not grant immunity from prejudice. It only made the scrutiny sharper, the expectations higher. But today he was focused. He had flown into Atlanta for one purpose: a high-stakes meeting with Skylink Airlines, a company teetering on the brink of financial collapse. If negotiations went as planned, his investment could save them. If they failed, well, Skylink wouldn't be the first airline to fold under the weight of its own missteps. As he neared the check-in counter, Elijah adjusted the strap of his sleek carry-on bag, exhaling a slow breath. He was here for business, nothing more, nothing less. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet foresee, was that within minutes, his presence in this terminal would trigger a chain of events that would unravel the careful facade of professionalism Skylink desperately clung to. The next 10 minutes would set the stage for a reckoning neither he nor the airline could afford to ignore. Elijah stepped up to the first-class check-in counter, setting his carry-on bag beside him as he offered the nearest attendant a polite nod. The woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Rachel, barely acknowledged him at first, tapping on her keyboard with an air of detached disinterest. Her blonde hair was neatly tied into a bun, her navy Skylink uniform crisp, but there was something in her posture, in the way her eyes flickered to him and then back to the screen, that set off a quiet alarm in Elijah's mind. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth, professional. "I have a flight to New York, first class." Rachel's fingers stilled over the keyboard for a brief second before she finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable but sharp in a way he had seen too many times before. "Name?" she asked, her tone flat, uninterested. "Elijah Carter." She typed it in, eyes scanning the monitor, then darting to his face again, as if searching for some inconsistency. Elijah watched as her brows knitted together slightly, and then she flicked a glance to the man working beside her, a younger agent named Tyler. Unlike Rachel, Tyler looked unsure, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Rachel exhaled through her nose, tilting her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see your name in the system." Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained neutral. "That's odd," he said, already reaching into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone and held up the confirmation email, the Skylink logo clearly visible at the top. "First-class ticket, flight 308 to JFK, booked under my corporate account." Rachel took a slow breath, her gaze lingering on the screen longer than necessary. She didn't move to verify it. Instead, she crossed her arms. "And you said your name is?" "Elijah Carter," he repeated, his patience thinning by degrees. Rachel's lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a frown, but certainly wasn't a smile either. "I'll have to check something," she muttered, her fingers moving sluggishly across the keyboard now, as if deliberately drawing out the process. Elijah glanced at Tyler, who was shifting from foot to foot, his discomfort evident. The young man's Adam's apple bobbed as he stole a glance at Rachel's screen, then at Elijah, then back down at his own hands. He knew something wasn't right, but he said nothing. "Sir, do you have identification?" Rachel asked, still not moving to check the reservation he had just provided. Elijah kept his composure, though his pulse had begun to drum an all-too-familiar rhythm against his ribs. He reached into his wallet, pulling out his passport, flipping it open and setting it down in front of her with deliberate precision. "Everything you need is right there," he said evenly. Rachel picked it up, scrutinizing the photo, her eyes flickering between it and his face. Again, too long, too much hesitation. Then, instead of proceeding with the check-in, she turned slightly and whispered something to Tyler. Elijah didn't catch the words, but he caught Tyler's reaction, the brief widening of his eyes, the way his fingers twitched before he quickly masked it with an awkward cough. Rachel straightened, placing the passport down but keeping one hand on it. "I'm going to need a moment," she said, stepping away from the counter. Elijah watched as she walked a few steps away, pulling out a small radio clipped to her waistband. The conversation was hushed, but he already knew. She was calling security. Elijah inhaled deeply through his nose, exhaling slowly as he kept his gaze fixed forward, his expression unreadable. He'd been here before. Maybe not here, in an airport check-in line, but here, in the silent accusation, in the unnecessary scrutiny, in the sinking realization that someone had already decided he didn't belong before he had even opened his mouth. Tyler cleared his throat, shifting again. His fingers drummed against the counter before he finally spoke, voice lower than before. I'm sure it's just a quick verification," he offered weakly. Elijah turned his gaze to him, measured and calm. "You and I both know she didn't even check my reservation before she called someone," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a quiet weight. Tyler looked away. She's just being careful." "Careful," Elijah repeated, his voice devoid of amusement. Tyler didn't respond. He looked uncomfortable, but not enough to intervene, not enough to stop what was already in motion. Elijah exhaled again, resisting the urge to rub his temple. This wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. Didn't settle into the hollows of his chest like a familiar ache. He adjusted the strap of his bag, his fingers tapping against the leather, his patience stretching thinner by the second. Then he saw them. 2 airport security officers walking toward him, their expressions unreadable, their postures stiff with authority. And just like that, the next 10 minutes of his life had been decided for him. Elijah kept his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the counter as the 2 uniformed officers closed the distance between them. The steady rhythm of their boots against the polished airport floor felt heavier than the surrounding noise, drowning out the hum of baggage carousels and the distant murmur of flight announcements. The moment stretched unbearably thin, tension curling in the air like an unseen fog, wrapping itself around the scene with suffocating weight. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples, came to a stop just beside him, eyes scanning Elijah with a detached scrutiny that made something deep in his chest tighten. His nameplate read Officer Beckett. The second officer, younger, barely in his 30s, stood slightly behind, his gaze flickering between Elijah, Rachel, and the small crowd that had begun to form at a respectful but interested distance. Rachel's expression was neutral, but her posture was telling. Arms crossed, chin lifted, her weight shifted onto one foot in a stance of quiet authority. She had summoned them, and now she watched with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had done the right thing. Tyler, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear, his fingers twitching at his sides, his jaw tight as he avoided Elijah's gaze entirely. "Sir," Officer Beckett said, his voice low and firm, "we've been asked to conduct a verification. Could you step aside with us for a moment?" Elijah let out a slow, measured breath, forcing down the flare of frustration that curled in his gut. He had expected this, felt it the moment Rachel's fingers had hovered over that radio, but that didn't make it easier. His mind ran through the same exhausting calculations, the internal checklist that had become second nature over the years. Keep your hands visible, keep your voice even, don't give them any reason to escalate. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Beckett, his expression unreadable. "I'd rather not step aside. You can verify whatever you need to right here." Beckett's jaw tensed just slightly, his posture shifting. Elijah had given the wrong answer. "It'll only take a few minutes," Beckett continued, his tone deceptively neutral, but the underlying implication was clear. Either Elijah complied or things would get more difficult. A ripple of unease passed through the onlookers. A few passengers exchanged wary glances. Some looked away, uninterested or unwilling to engage, but others held their ground, watching carefully, their faces tight with something close to anticipation. as if they had seen this unfold before and already knew how the script would play out. A woman standing near the baggage drop shifted uncomfortably, gripping the hand of the small boy beside her. Her dark curls were pulled into a loose ponytail, her tired eyes darting between Elijah and the officers, her expression pinched with something that looked like quiet fear. Her son, no older than 7, stared up at her in confusion, tugging at her fingers, but she just squeezed his hand tighter, pulling him closer to her side. Elijah exhaled slowly, centering himself, then gestured toward the counter. "My first-class ticket is booked under my corporate account. My name is Elijah Carter. My passport is right here." His voice was level, but there was no mistaking the quiet steel beneath it. "If Rachel here had actually checked before calling you, this conversation wouldn't be necessary." Beckett's gaze flickered toward Rachel, who straightened her spine but said nothing. His partner, who had remained silent up until now, cleared his throat. "Do you have business with Skylink?" Elijah nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, pulling out a neatly folded document. He handed it over, watching as the younger officer skimmed the letterhead. A formal invitation from Skylink's executive team, complete with contact information and verification of his status as an investor and business partner. The younger officer's eyes flickered with something close to recognition, his grip on the paper tightening slightly before he handed it to Beckett. "Sir, I'll need to confirm this," Beckett muttered, already reaching for his radio. Elijah remained still, waiting, even as he felt the weight of every stare around him. Someone a few feet away held up their phone, the faint red glow of a recording indicator blinking against the reflection of the terminal windows. A hushed voice whispered something. "Is he famous?" "No, I think they just stopped him 'cause no way they called security on a guy in a damn suit." The minutes dragged. Beckett spoke low into his radio, stepping a few feet away as he relayed the details of the document. The second officer remained in place, though his posture had shifted ever so slightly, his initial tension now tinged with something else. Ratio stood rigid, her expression carefully controlled, but her fingers curled slightly against the counter, nails tapping once, twice against the polished surface. Tyler, beside her, swallowed hard, his face pale. Then Beckett's radio crackled. A voice on the other end, too garbled to make out entirely, spoke for several long seconds. Beckett's mouth flattened into a thin line, his nods small, almost reluctant. Then he turned back to Elijah. "Mr. Carter," he said, and for the first time, the slight edge of formality entered his voice. "Your credentials check out. You're free to continue." Elijah didn't move at first. He just let the words settle, let them sink into the silence that followed. And then, with a deliberate, precise motion, he reached for his passport, taking it back with the same care he had given when offering it in the first place. He met Beckett's gaze, holding it for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Of course I am." He turned then, shifting his attention to Rachel. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, but there was something new in her gaze now. Not quite embarrassment, but a flicker of something else. A private, internal realization she would never voice aloud. He leveled his stare at her, voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Next time, verify before you assume." Rachel's lips parted slightly, as if to argue, but no words came. Tyler beside her looked down. Elijah straightened his cuffs, exhaling slowly. He took his boarding pass, lifted his carry-on, and turned toward the security checkpoint without another word. The crowd, still lingering, began to break apart. The woman who had been clutching her son's hand finally let out a breath, her fingers loosening. The man who had been recording lowered his phone. A few hushed murmurs echoed through the space, but no one spoke to him directly. And behind him, Rachel stood frozen, her arms still crossed but her fingers gripping her own wrist, just a little too tightly. She had gotten what she wanted. Almost. But something in the air had shifted. Something she hadn't expected. Elijah hadn't made it 20 feet from the counter before he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a video being played back. The sharp buzz of voices overlapping in digital clarity. Someone had uploaded the footage, and it was already spreading. They really called security on a black man in a suit? A younger guy in jeans and a hoodie muttered, shaking his head as he scrolled through his phone. "Not just any black man," his friend responded, eyes widening. "That's Elijah Carter, CEO of Nexus Technologies." "You're kidding," a woman nearby said, leaning over to glance at the screen. "They called the cops on a CEO?" Man showed them his passport, his flight confirmation, and a whole letter from the damn airline execs. The first man scoffed. "And they still pulled that nonsense?" The murmurs spread, rolling through the crowd like ripples on water. The people who had witnessed it firsthand now had their suspicions confirmed with visual proof, and those who had only caught the tail end were seeing it unfold from the beginning. Some just shook their heads, muttering about how ridiculous it was. Others, especially those who had seen this kind of thing happen before, felt a familiar, simmering anger. A white businessman in an expensive blazer frowned at his phone, scrolling through the comments under the video. "It's always the same story," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. A black mother with her young son, still holding onto her hand, let out a quiet exhale, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of his head. "You see why I tell you to be careful," she murmured. The little boy nodded solemnly, though he looked like he didn't fully understand yet. Another man wearing noise-canceling headphones around his neck snorted. "They probably thought he was scamming his way into first class. Can't have a black man with money unless he stole it, right?" More people began to whisper, some turning toward Rachel and Tyler at the counter, eyes narrowing, waiting for some kind of explanation. Rachel, still standing with her arms crossed, stiffened under the weight of their stares, her fingers pressing into her sleeves. Tyler, on the other hand, looked pale, his eyes darting from the check-in screen to Elijah's retreating figure and back again. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Elijah heard it all. He could feel the shift in energy, the way the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on the terminal like a thick, unshakable fog. He could have kept walking, let it play out behind him, but something in him resisted. He wasn't finished. He turned back. Rachel's shoulders squared instinctively as he approached, her posture tightening, though she didn't step back. Tyler, however, did. His feet shuffled half an inch before he forced himself still. Elijah stopped just short of the counter, setting his bag down with controlled precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You called the police before even looking at my paperwork?" His voice was quiet, but the authority in it left no room for misinterpretation. Rachel's lips pressed together, her nostrils flaring slightly. "Sir, I was following protocol," she said, her voice clipped. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Protocol?" Rachel nodded sharply. "When something seems suspicious, we are trained to alert security." A muscle in Elijah's jaw flexed, but he didn't let the frustration show in his voice. "And what exactly seemed suspicious about me?" Rachel hesitated. The pause was all the confirmation Elijah needed. Tyler exhaled sharply through his nose, staring at the counter like he wished it would swallow him whole. "I presented my boarding pass, my ID, my business documents," Elijah continued, his voice steady, measured. "And you still decided I needed to be checked. Why?" Rachel's fingers twitched slightly where they rested against her sleeve. "Like I said, sir, it's just standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" Elijah echoed, his brows lifting slightly. "Tell me, how many of the passengers before me did you call security on?" Rachel's jaw locked, but she didn't answer. Tyler finally spoke, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "None," he admitted. Rachel's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing, but the damage had already been done. Tyler looked miserable, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as he stared down at it, refusing to meet Elijah's gaze. Elijah inhaled slowly, exhaling just as evenly. He knew he wasn't going to get an apology, not from Rachel, maybe not from Tyler either. But this moment wasn't just about him. It was about the people watching, the ones recording, the ones who would replay this later and remember. He picked up his bag, nodding once. "You should think about what you just did," he said simply. And then he walked away. Elijah barely made it a few steps before he felt the weight of the moment settle around him like a heavy cloak. The energy in the terminal had shifted, thick with something unspoken but undeniable. He wasn't the only one who felt it. A young black man near the seating area clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles paled, his jaw tight as he watched Elijah walk past. His breathing was slow and deliberate, his chest rising and falling with measured restraint, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. His fingers flexed once before curling into fists again. The anger wasn't just for Elijah. It was for every moment like this he had witnessed. Every time he or someone he knew had been made to feel small, questioned, humiliated, doubted. Nearby, a white businessman in a tailored gray suit, someone who had initially seemed uninterested in the commotion, now shook his head, exhaling sharply. He pulled out his phone, scanning through the news alerts popping up about the incident, his brows furrowing. It was clear he was rethinking everything he had assumed in the past, perhaps realizing just how often these moments played out around him without him ever paying attention. He muttered something under his breath, his fingers tightening around his briefcase handle as if holding on to it steadied him. A middle-aged Latina woman, standing just a few feet away from the counter, hesitated before stepping forward, her face a mixture of quiet sadness and hesitation. She looked as if she was debating whether to speak, but something in her expression suggested she had already made up her mind. She took a breath and closed the distance between them. Elijah noticed her approach before she spoke, pausing mid-step. "I've seen this before," she said softly, her voice laced with something deeper than sympathy, understanding. "I'm so sorry." Elijah held her gaze, the sincerity in her words cutting through the static in his mind. She wasn't just sorry in the way people say when they see something unfair. She was sorry because she had lived it, because she had stood on the other side of moments like this and knew exactly how it felt. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, but before he could say anything, she continued. "My husband," she said, swallowing thickly, "he's a doctor, and I've lost count of how many times people have assumed he wasn't." She glanced toward the check-in counter, where Rachel was still stiff as a statue, her face unreadable but her arms crossed tighter now. "People like her, they never even realize what they're doing, not really. And even if they do, they won't ever say it out loud." Elijah exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No," he said quietly. "They won't." The woman pressed her lips together, something flashing across her face, something close to exhaustion. "They'll call it protocol, caution, a misunderstanding, anything but what it really is." Elijah looked back toward the counter. Rachel was avoiding his gaze now, pretending to be busy with her screen, but Tyler wasn't. He was still standing there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes flickering between Elijah and the crowd. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear, but knew he never would. "I appreciate you saying something," Elijah said, turning back to the woman. She gave him a small, sad smile. "I wish I could do more," she admitted. "But at the very least, people are paying attention." He glanced around, noting the number of passengers still watching, still processing. The phone cameras had stopped recording, but the moment had already left its mark. It wouldn't just disappear. "I hope so," he said. The woman gave him one last nod before stepping back, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Elijah standing there with the weight of the exchange settling in his chest. A few feet away, the young black man who had been clenching his fists finally let out a slow breath, his hands relaxing at his sides. He caught Elijah's eye and nodded once, a silent gesture that said everything words couldn't. Elijah nodded back before turning, adjusting his bag strap and heading toward security. He didn't look back at the counter again. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Elijah stood there, motionless, his fingers curled loosely around the handle of his carry-on. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't demand an apology that would never come. Instead, he let the silence stretch, thick and suffocating, letting Rachel and Tyler feel the weight of it. The energy around them had shifted. The judgment they had so confidently placed on him now reflected back at them tenfold, lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. Rachel refused to meet his eyes. She kept her arms crossed, her shoulders squared, her mouth pressed into a thin, stubborn line, but there was no mistaking the tension in her stance. She wasn't as unaffected as she wanted to appear. Her fingers twitched slightly where they rested on her biceps, a subtle, unconscious betrayal of the discomfort creeping in. Tyler, on the other hand, was unraveling. His shoulders slumped, his face pale, his eyes darting between Elijah and the floor, unable to hold his gaze for more than a second. The reality of what had just happened was sinking into his bones, settling into his conscience in a way that wouldn't leave him, no matter how much he wanted to pretend it would. Elijah exhaled slowly, deliberately, keeping his voice even, controlled. "You should really think about what you just did." Rachel flinched, just barely, but it was there. A flicker of something behind her eyes, though she didn't let it show on her face. Tyler let out a shaky breath, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Elijah let the moment stretch a little longer, watching them, memorizing the way their guilt and defensiveness warred against each other. He wasn't expecting an apology. He knew he wouldn't get one, but he wanted them to feel this. He wanted them to remember this moment the next time they had the urge to second-guess a black man in a suit, the next time they felt that insidious little whisper in their heads, telling them someone. He turned away, adjusting the strap of his bag, and walked toward security without another word. The conversations around him swelled again, hushed and urgent, as people processed what had just unfolded. Some shook their heads, muttering about how ridiculous it all was. Others stayed quiet, their expressions unreadable. A few, the ones who had filmed it, were already uploading the footage, their fingers moving quickly over their screens, captions being added in real time. Rachel and Tyler remained frozen at the counter. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. Elijah stepped through the sleek glass doors of Skylink's corporate headquarters, the quiet hum of the lobby a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind at the airport. The building exuded an air of polished efficiency with its high ceilings, minimalist decor, and a massive digital display showcasing Skylink's global flight network. Employees bustled past, dressed in sharp suits and pencil skirts, moving with the urgency of people who understood just how fragile their company's future was. Skylink was drowning financially, and today's meeting was their best chance at survival. A receptionist glanced up as he approached, her expression shifting the moment she registered his name on her screen. "Mr. Carter, welcome. The board is expecting you. Ms. Brooks will meet you in the conference room." Elijah nodded, his voice even. "Thank you." As he followed her through the glass-paneled hallways, his mind flickered back to the airport, to the tightening of his chest when security had approached, to the way Rachel had refused to acknowledge what she had done. He could still feel the weight of it, the simmering frustration that had been forced into silence, but he pushed it aside. This was what mattered now, the deal, the business, the power shift he was about to orchestrate. The conference room doors slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a long, polished table surrounded by towering windows that framed the Atlanta skyline. At the head of the table stood Vanessa Brooks, Skylink's CEO. She was a formidable presence, early 50s, silver streaks threading through her tightly coiled black hair, her tailored suit immaculate, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She wasn't the type to waste time with pleasantries, and that was something Elijah respected. The moment she saw him, she stepped forward, her handshake firm, her expression unreadable but intent. "Elijah," she said, her voice low, measured. "I heard something happened at the airport. Are you okay?" Elijah studied her for a moment, taking in the way her gaze flickered with something beneath the surface. Concern, maybe, or calculated awareness? He could tell she already knew the basics, maybe even had a report sitting in her inbox, but she wanted to hear it from him. He kept his expression neutral, controlled. It was handled. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look convinced, but she also wasn't the type to push if she knew she wouldn't get an answer. Instead, she motioned toward the table. "Let's sit. The board is eager to hear your proposal." Elijah nodded, stepping forward, but as he pulled out his chair, he caught the quick, assessing glances exchanged between two board members, seated near the far end of the table. Gerald Walsh, an older white man with a stiff posture and an air of quiet disapproval, and Lillian Cho, a sharp-eyed executive who had built a reputation for keeping Skylink's financials from completely collapsing. Gerald's expression barely shifted as he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. We appreciate you making time for us, Mr. Carter. I imagine you've had a rather eventful morning." Elijah didn't react. He knew exactly what Gerald was doing, testing him, waiting to see if he would let the weight of the airport incident bleed into this room. He gave a slow, calculated nod. "Nothing I haven't dealt with before," he said smoothly. A beat of silence stretched between them before Lillian cleared her throat, shifting slightly in her seat. "We're looking forward to hearing how your investment can position Skylink for long-term success," she said, smoothly redirecting the conversation. "Shall we begin?" Elijah glanced at Vanessa, who gave him the smallest, approving nod. He rolled his shoulders back, steady and unshaken, then opened his portfolio. Elijah adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, his movements deliberate as he placed a sleek leather folder on the table and flipped it open. The Skylink board members, seated in a precise row of polished suits and careful expressions, leaned forward slightly, waiting for him to begin. A large screen at the front of the conference room displayed the agenda, a clean, professional breakdown of Skylink's financial standing, market weaknesses, and the potential lifeline Elijah's company was offering. He took his time scanning the room, meeting each board member's gaze in turn, measuring their level of resistance before he spoke. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, unreadable but attentive. Lillian Cho, the financial strategist, had her pen poised over a notepad, prepared to counter or question anything that didn't sit right with her. Gerald Walsh, the old guard, sat stiffly, watching Elijah with an expression of carefully veiled skepticism. The rest of the board remained silent but alert, sensing the tension that hung in the air like an electric charge. Elijah finally leaned back slightly, exuding a calm confidence that was impossible to ignore. "Skylink is at a crossroads," he began, his voice smooth, controlled. "The numbers are clear. You're bleeding cash. Market share has shrunk by nearly 15% in the last fiscal year. Operational costs are rising, and customer retention is at an all-time low. In short, if something doesn't change soon, this company won't be around to see the next decade." A few board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one refuted his statement. They couldn't. The numbers were right there on the screen. "Now," Elijah continued, clasping his hands together, "what I'm offering is more than just an influx of capital. Money alone won't fix this. You don't need a bailout, you need a partner. Someone who understands the direction this industry is moving and can position Skylink as a leader, not just another outdated airline struggling to stay afloat." He tapped a key on his tablet and the screen behind him shifted, displaying a streamlined breakdown of his proposed investment. New technology integration, route expansion, and a brand overhaul focused on elevating Skylink's reputation. "My company, Nexus Technologies, has built a model on efficiency and customer engagement," Elijah continued. "With the right data-driven approach, we can optimize flight routes, implement seamless digital check-ins, and create a customer loyalty program that actually works. More importantly, with strategic partnerships, we can reduce overhead costs and bring in new revenue streams. The result? Increased profitability, higher customer satisfaction, and a brand that can compete, not just survive." There was a flicker of interest now, a shift in the board's collective energy. A few of them nodded slightly, taking notes. Even Lillian was listening closely, her analytical mind already breaking down the figures in real time. But Gerald Walsh, he still hadn't said a word. He simply sat there, studying Elijah with that same unreadable expression, fingers tapping against the polished wood of the table. Elijah could feel it, the hesitation, the resistance. It wasn't about the numbers. It wasn't even about the deal. It was about him. He let the silence settle for a moment, allowing the weight of what had happened at the airport to fully take shape in the minds of those around him. Because no one was saying it, not directly, but it was there, lingering beneath the surface, pressing against the edges of this conversation. So he addressed it head-on. Elijah straightened, his expression unreadable, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. "But before we move forward," he said, letting the words hang in the air for a beat, "let's address the culture of this airline." A ripple went through the room, subtle but undeniable. Gerald's fingers stilled, Lillian's pen paused mid-word. A few of the executives darted quick glances at each other, uncertain. Vanessa sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but her sharp eyes locked on him. Elijah leaned forward, pressing his fingertips against the table, his gaze sweeping the room. "I walked into this building today after being racially profiled by your own staff at the airport. I was questioned, detained, and treated as a security threat because your employees assumed I didn't belong." No one spoke. He let the weight of it settle. "You need investors. You need someone with the vision and resources to turn this airline around. And yet when I arrived at your terminal, I wasn't seen as a business partner. I wasn't seen as a customer. I was seen as a problem to be dealt with." Gerald's face tightened slightly, his fingers curling against the armrest of his chair. Elijah turned his gaze toward him, his tone still measured but sharp. "Now we can talk numbers all day, but if we don't address this, if we don't fix the rot inside this company's culture, then none of this will matter. Because your customers, they notice. Your employees, they notice. And if Skylink can't prove that it stands for something better, then no amount of investment will save it." The room was silent. Vanessa exhaled slowly, folding her hands together. Lillian tapped her pen once against the table, her gaze thoughtful. Some of the board members looked uncomfortable, unsure whether they should acknowledge the issue or pretend it didn't happen. Gerald finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "Are you suggesting that Skylink has a systemic problem, Mr. Carter?" Elijah's eyes didn't waver. "I'm suggesting that we, if we're going to do business together, need to make sure this company reflects the values it claims to stand for. And that means taking real action, not just issuing empty PR statements." Vanessa's lips curled slightly, the smallest ghost of approval flashing in her gaze before she turned to the rest of the board. "He's right," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had already made up her mind. "We can't afford to ignore this. Not anymore." Gerald's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Elijah leaned back slightly, exuding the same calm confidence as when he had walked in. "So," he said, letting the silence settle just long enough to keep them uncomfortable, "are we ready to talk about real change, or are we just here to go through the motions?" A sharp vibration cut through the tense silence. Vanessa's phone, face down on the table, buzzed again. She barely glanced at it at first, her focus still on the lingering weight of Elijah's words. But something in the way the device rattled against the polished wood caught her attention. It wasn't a routine notification. She picked it up, her expression still unreadable, but as her eyes flicked over the screen, something in her face changed. So subtle it was almost imperceptible, except to those who were paying attention. Elijah was. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she tapped the screen, opening an email marked urgent with a red flag next to it. She didn't react right away, but the way her shoulders stiffened, the barely there inhale she took sent a ripple of unease through the room. Gerald noticed. His gaze sharpened. "Something wrong, Vanessa?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she swiped up, enlarging the message, and then, without a word, turned the screen slightly so Elijah could see. His eyes flickered down, scanning the subject line first. Unspoken passenger vetting, priority alerts. His own name was in the body of the email. His stomach tightened, a slow, cold weight settling in his chest as his gaze trailed down to the sender's information. Internal. The email had come from someone within Skylink's executive security division, marked as a confidential operational directive. The text was brief, almost clinical in its detachment. In accordance with our unspoken passenger vetting system, certain individuals should be flagged for priority screening at check-in. If any name on this list appears in our system, staff should proceed with additional verification measures to ensure security compliance. His name was second on the list. Elijah leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, forcing his face to remain neutral, even as something slow and simmering coiled beneath his ribs. He had already known, on some level. He had felt it in the way Rachel's demeanor had shifted the moment she looked up from her screen, in the unnecessary scrutiny, in the deliberate way she had escalated things before even verifying his credentials. But seeing it laid out like this, in black and white, in a company-wide directive, That was different. That was undeniable. Vanessa's fingers curled slightly against the table. She was still staring at the email, her jaw tight. This wasn't supposed to exist. Elijah let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. And yet, here we are. Gerald's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened. Where did that come from? Vanessa turned the phone back toward herself, scrolling down, scanning the thread. Anonymous tip-off. Someone inside the company leaked it. Looks like a forwarded email chain. Whoever sent this didn't want their name attached. Elijah watched her carefully. But you knew something like this was in place, didn't you? She looked up then, her sharp gaze meeting his without hesitation. Not officially, she said, her tone clipped. But I've been hearing rumors about internal profiling methods for months. Nothing I could confirm, nothing that ever made its way to my desk in writing. Because that's how these things are designed, Eliche said, his voice still controlled but carrying a quiet edge. You keep it off the books, make it unwritten policy. That way, when it gets exposed, you can act shocked and claim plausible deniability. Vanessa's expression darkened, but not at him, at the situation unraveling in front of her. Elijah turned his gaze toward the rest of the board. Gerald was watching, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Lillian Cho's lips were pressed together, her eyes flicking toward Vanessa, then back to the email, calculating. Some of the other board members were shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsettled. I assume I'm not the only name on that list, Elijah said after a moment. Vanessa swiped down, her expression growing more grim. You're not. Elijah nodded once, slowly. And I assume that list is mostly people who look like me? No one answered. That was answer enough. The room felt heavier now. The deal itself momentarily forgotten as the reality of what had just been revealed settled over them all. This wasn't just an airport misunderstanding. This wasn't just one rogue employee acting on personal bias. This was systemic. This was built into the infrastructure of Skylink's security protocol, an unspoken directive instructing employees to flag, delay, and interrogate passengers based on invisible criteria that had nothing to do with actual threats and everything to do with appearance. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around her phone. Whoever leaked this, she said, her voice low, measured, but dangerous, just put a grenade in the middle of this company. Elijah watched her carefully. Then the only question left is, what are you going to do about it? Rachel sat stiffly at the far end of the long conference table, arms crossed so tightly against her chest it looked like she was holding herself together by force. The room around her was sterile, sharp, and cold, the kind of place where careers were decided with a signature on a document or a single sentence from the right person. Tyler sat next to her, looking distinctly less composed. His knee bounced under the table, his fingers twitching against his pant leg, his face pale beneath the artificial glow of the overhead lighting. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour replaying every decision that had led him to this moment, and realizing, too late, that none of them had been the right one. Across from them, Elijah sat motionless, his presence in the room an undeniable force, though he hadn't said a word yet. Next to him, Vanessa stood, her expression unreadable, the email still pulled up on the tablet in her hands. The senior executives flanked them, each of them carrying varying degrees of discomfort, irritation, and, at least in some cases, barely concealed embarrassment. The air was thick with something unspoken, but the truth of it was obvious. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. Vanessa didn't waste time. Do either of you want to explain why we're sitting here right now? Rachel lifted her chin, her face a mask of indifference, though her fingers curled ever so slightly against the fabric of her blazer. I followed procedure, she said coolly. Vanessa's lips pressed together, a quiet exhale passing through her nose before she turned her gaze to Tyler. And you? Tyler swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Rachel, then Elijah, then back down at the table. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. He stopped, dragging in a breath, then tried again. I didn't know about the list. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. The list? Tyler's fingers twitched against his knee. The priority vetting list, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's head snapped toward him, her eyes widening slightly, but Tyler didn't stop. The words had started tumbling out, and now he couldn't seem to stop them. "I didn't know it was a company-wide thing," he said quickly, like he needed them to believe him before they made up their minds. "I swear, I didn't. I followed Rachel's lead. I thought she recognized something I didn't, and I didn't question it because he hesitated, then let out a breath that sounded closer to defeat than anything else. Because I didn't want to make trouble." Elijah exhaled slowly, the sound soft but weighted. Rachel turned toward Tyler fully now, her voice sharpening. "Tyler, I didn't question it," he repeated, a little louder this time, as if he needed to say it again to make himself fully understand it. "I should have. I knew something wasn't right when she called security before even checking his information, but I told myself she must have had a reason." He finally looked up, his gaze finding Elijah's across the table, and this time, he didn't look away. "I was wrong," Rachel scoffed, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Vanessa's gaze flickered to her. "You have something to say?" Rachel's lips pressed together for half a second before she straightened, folding her hands neatly in front of her on the table, her back rigid. "I followed procedure," she repeated, her voice as steady as it had been when the meeting began. "If someone appears suspicious, we escalate. That's what we're trained to do." Vanessa's jaw flexed. "And what exactly was suspicious about Mr. Carter?" Rachel hesitated. Just for a second. But it was long enough. Vanessa didn't break eye contact. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, measured. "Did you think I had a fake passport?" Rachel didn't answer. "Did you think I was lying about my flight?" Silence. Elijah exhaled. "Or did you just think a black man in first class didn't belong?" Rachel's nostrils flared slightly, her face tightening, but she still didn't speak. Elijah let the silence stretch, unblinking. "Say it," he said quietly. Rachel swallowed, her fingers curling slightly against the edge of the table. She stopped, her jaw working. Then finally, she let out a breath. "I did what I was trained to do." Vanessa shook her head, disgust flashing across her face. "No, you didn't." Rachel frowned. "Excuse me?" Vanessa's voice remained sharp, but there was something cold in it now, something lethal. "I've seen the training materials. There's nothing in them that says a well-dressed businessman with proper identification and a first-class ticket should be immediately flagged for security. There's nothing in them that says we assume guilt before checking facts. So don't sit there and try to justify what you did as training." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You didn't follow company policy, you followed your own." Rachel's expression barely wavered, but something behind her eyes flickered. Vanessa straightened, shifting her gaze between both of them. "You both had choices in that moment," she said, her tone steely. "Rachel, you chose to escalate instead of verifying. Tyler, you chose to stay silent instead of questioning it." She exhaled, shaking her head. "And now, the entire company is about to pay the price." Tyler swallowed hard. Rachel's face remained stiff, unreadable. Elijah finally spoke again, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. "I want to be clear about something," he said, his gaze steady. "You didn't just humiliate me. You didn't just make a bad judgment call. You contributed to a system that has real consequences. Do you know how many times these situations don't end with a boardroom discussion? How many times people like me get dragged off flights, detained, arrested, worse?" Rachel looked away. Elijah didn't let up. "Do you know what it's like to live your life expecting that no matter how much success you earn, no matter how many deals you close, no matter how many seats at the table you take, there will always be someone like you waiting to remind me that in your eyes, I'll never quite belong?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Vanessa inhaled deeply, pressing her hands against the table. "Rachel," she said, her voice clipped. "Final. You're fired. Effective immediately." Rachel's head snapped up. "You can't. Watch me." Vanessa's tone left no room for argument. Rachel sat there for a moment, her mouth opening as if she wanted to argue, but there was no fight left. She knew. She had lost. Tyler's breath came out unsteady. He didn't look relieved, just resigned. Vanessa turned toward him. "You're on probation. You'll be required to undergo full bias training and a performance review. And if I so much as hear a whisper that you've made another poor decision, you're done." Tyler nodded quickly, his relief evident. "I understand." Vanessa's gaze swept over both of them one last time. "Get out of my sight." Rachel rose stiffly, grabbing her things. Tyler followed, head low. As the door shut behind them, Vanessa exhaled, shaking her head. "Unbelievable." Elijah leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Believe it." The tension in the boardroom hadn't settled, even after Rachel and Tyler were escorted out. If anything, the weight of what had just unfolded only deepened the silence, stretching between the executives like an unspoken threat. Vanessa pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table, inhaling deeply as she turned toward Lillian Cho, who had been quiet through most of the meeting but was now furiously typing on her tablet. "Where are we on the internal audit?" Vanessa's voice was sharp, her patience frayed. Lillian barely looked up as she spoke. "Its security pulled the flagged email and started tracking the chain. Whoever leaked it forwarded it from an anonymous account, but the original message came from inside our system. We should have the source in a few minutes." Elijah sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left Vanessa. He could see it, the way her fingers curled slightly against the table, the way her shoulders had tensed just enough to betray how much this entire situation was spiraling out of her control. She wasn't just dealing with a PR nightmare, she was facing a reckoning inside her own company. A sharp knock on the glass door cut through the heavy air, and a man in a headset and an IT badge stepped in, holding a tablet. His expression was unreadable, but his grip on the device was tight, controlled. He walked briskly to Vanessa's side and placed the tablet on the table, turning it toward her. "We found it," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The original sender was Daniel Walsh." The reaction was immediate. A few board members tensed, shifting in their seats. Others exchanged quick, cautious glances, but one person remained still. Daniel Walsh, one of the senior-most board members, didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't even pretend to be surprised. He simply let out a slow exhale, adjusted his cufflinks, and leaned back in his chair as if he had been expecting this moment. Vanessa didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at the screen, scanning the metadata, the timestamps, the undeniable evidence that one of her own had been orchestrating the very discrimination that had put them in this position in the first place. Elijah watched her closely. He already knew how this was going to go. Vanessa finally straightened, turning her head just enough to look directly at Daniel. "Tell me," she said, her voice quiet but sharp, "how long have you been running this little operation?" Daniel let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Let's not be dramatic, Vanessa." Her jaw tightened. "Oh, I think dramatic would be an appropriate reaction to one of my board members sending out a racial profiling directive and then pretending to be shocked when it blows up in our faces." Daniel shrugged slightly, his demeanor irritatingly relaxed. "I never sent out a directive. I made a recommendation." Elijah arched an eyebrow. "A recommendation?" Daniel turned to him then, his gaze cool, assessing. "Let's be honest here, Carter. Airlines vet passengers all the time. Every major corporation has security protocols. Some are just a little more specific than others." Elijah's fingers tapped once against the table. Slow, controlled, specific, he repeated. Daniel didn't blink. "If you're asking whether I think additional screening for certain demographics makes sense, then yes, I do. If you're asking whether I regret the way this particular situation was handled, then sure, maybe I would have told Rachel to be a little more subtle about it." A muscle in Vanessa's jaw twitched. "You don't even sound sorry." Daniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Come on, Vanessa. You and I both know the real problem here isn't what I did. It's that I got caught." The room fell into a stunned silence. Elijah let the words sink in, rolling them over in his mind, feeling the weight of just how comfortable Daniel was saying them out loud. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't regretful. He wasn't even trying to spin it. Because people like Daniel didn't need to lie. They simply counted on the fact that their power would protect them. Vanessa exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers together as if centering herself. Then she pushed back from the table and rose to her feet, her movements controlled but decisive. "You're done, Daniel," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Effective immediately." The room barely breathed. Daniel's smirk didn't drop right away. He simply tilted his head slightly as if trying to gauge how serious she was, but when Vanessa didn't blink, didn't waver, his amusement faded. "You can't be serious," he scoffed, shifting forward in his chair. Vanessa just held out a hand. "Hand over your access badge." Daniel's expression darkened, but he didn't move. Vanessa glanced toward the IT specialist. "Revoke his system access. Now." The man nodded once, tapping something on his tablet. A few seconds later, Daniel's phone vibrated against the table. He glanced at it, swiped the screen, and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Just like that." Vanessa's voice was steel. "Just like that." Daniel's smirk twisted into something mean. "You think this makes you look good?" He turned to the rest of the board. "You think firing me is going to magically fix this mess? The media's already got their hands on it. The public already sees this company for what it is." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You can throw me under the bus, Vanessa, but it won't change a damn thing." Elijah spoke then, his voice quiet but cutting through the space like a blade. "No," he said, "but it's a start." Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked at Elijah like a real threat. Vanessa just stared at him, unblinking. "Security is waiting outside. You can leave on your own, or you can be escorted." Daniel pushed back from the table, standing slowly, his eyes sweeping the room. Then, finally, he let out a sharp breath and shook his head. "You're making a mistake," he muttered before turning and striding toward the door. No one stopped him. The silence in the room was deafening as the door clicked shut behind him. Vanessa exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. "Jesus Christ," she muttered. Elijah leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Now, the real work begins. The moment Daniel walked out, the tension in the boardroom remained thick, lingering like smoke after a fire. No one spoke right away, the reality of what had just unfolded settling into their bones. The weight of it wasn't just about Daniel, or Rachel, or even Tyler. It was about the entire company and the reckoning that had just begun. Vanessa let out a sharp exhale, rubbing her temples before dropping her hands onto the table. "Lillian," she said, her voice tight but controlled, "I want a full compliance audit starting today. I don't care how deep we have to dig if there are more Daniels in this company. We find them before they make us their next PR disaster." Lillian nodded, already typing out messages on her tablet. The other board members shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others still visibly shaken by how quickly things had escalated. Vanessa turned toward Elijah. "We'll fix this," she said, and for the first time her voice held something beyond frustration, resolve. "I'm not letting this company go down because of people like him." Elijah studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then prove it." Outside the conference room, security had already begun escorting Daniel through the hallways. His usual air of arrogance had been chipped away, his posture slightly stiffer than before, but he still carried himself like a man who believed he would land on his feet. Rachel wasn't so composed. She stood at the reception desk near the elevators, her arms crossed, her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. One of the HR representatives was speaking to her, their expression neutral, professional, but the words were unmistakable. She was done. Effective immediately. "You'll receive your final paycheck within the next business cycle. Your belongings will be mailed to your listed address. Security will escort you out." Rachel's face remained impassive, but her fingers curled at her sides, her nails pressing into her palms. "You're making a mistake," she muttered, echoing Daniel's last words. "I was doing my job." The HR rep didn't even blink. "Your actions violated company policy and led to a direct PR and legal liability. The decision is final." Rachel's nostrils flared, but she didn't argue. She just turned sharply on her heel, her shoes clicking against the marble floor as she walked toward the exit, her spine rigid with fury. A few feet away, Tyler stood frozen, his posture tense, his face pale. When his name was called, he stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly. The HR rep's voice was firm, but not cruel. "You'll be placed on a strict probationary program," they said. "That includes mandatory bias training, compliance courses, and oversight on all future decisions regarding customer interactions. You will be monitored closely. One mistake and your employment is terminated." Tyler swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "I understand." Elijah watched all of it from a distance, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. The rhythmic hum of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport filled the air as Elijah walked through the main entrance, the familiar scent of coffee and jet fuel mixing in the background. It had been a month since his last visit, since the confrontation at the check-in counter, since the fallout that sent ripples through Skylink's corporate offices. This time, as he strode toward the first-class check-in, there were no suspicious glances, no whispered conversations, no subtle yet pointed delays. The staff behind the counter were focused, professional, engaged in their tasks with an efficiency that suggested a newfound awareness of the consequences of getting it wrong. A woman in a navy Skylink blazer greeted him with a warm but respectful smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. Checking in for your flight to New York?" He nodded, setting his carry-on down beside him. "That's right." She typed quickly, scanning the system before nodding. "I see your reservation here. You're all set, Mr. Carter. Would you like assistance with anything else?" Elijah held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, searching for any hint of hesitation, any flicker of doubt, but there was none. Just efficiency, just professionalism, just how it should have been from the start. He gave a slight nod. "I'm good, thank you." As he reached for his boarding pass, he felt movement from the corner of his eye, a hesitant presence lingering just a few feet away. When he turned, he saw Tyler. The younger man looked different, less rigid, more self-aware. His usual nervous energy was still there, but it wasn't the same kind of jittery anxiety he had displayed a month ago. This wasn't the discomfort of someone who wanted to escape a situation. It was the discomfort of someone stepping forward despite the weight in their chest. "Mr. Carter," Tyler said, his voice careful, uncertain. Elijah exhaled slowly, tucking his boarding pass into his pocket. "Tyler," Tyler swallowed, rubbing a hand against the back of his neck. I know you probably don't want to hear anything from me, and I don't blame you." He let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening into fists before relaxing again. "But I wanted to say I'm sorry, not just for what happened that day, but for not stopping it, for standing there and letting it happen." Elijah studied him, his expression unreadable. Tyler shook his head slightly, his voice thick with something close to regret. "I knew it was wrong. The second Rachel called security, I knew, but I didn't do anything. And I've been thinking about that every day since—" A brief pause, then softer. "I've been going through the training, the reviews, all of it, and I get it now. I get how easy it is to be complicit, to let things happen just because speaking up is uncomfortable." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "But I don't want to be that guy anymore." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, letting Tyler's words settle. The apology didn't erase what had happened. It didn't take away the humiliation, the anger, the deep exhaustion of knowing he would always have to be prepared for moments like that. But it was something, and not just an apology, a choice, a decision to be better. Elijah finally spoke, his voice even, steady. "It's never too late to be better." Tyler's shoulders eased just slightly, his breath coming out in a shaky exhale. Elijah gave him a long look, then nodded once before turning toward the security checkpoint. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Skylink didn't just release a carefully crafted statement and move on. They didn't bury the scandal under corporate jargon or wait for the media cycle to shift. They knew they couldn't afford to. The fallout had been too big, too public, too damning, and for once, a corporation did what so many before them had failed to do. They acted. It started with mandatory anti-bias training rolled out across every department, from executives to ground staff. Employees who had once brushed off conversations about racial profiling were now sitting through immersive workshops, forced to confront the implicit biases they had been carrying, whether they wanted to or not. Some were resistant at first, shifting in their seats, arms crossed, eyes filled with quiet skepticism, but the footage of Elijah's encounter, now viewed millions of times online, played on screens in those very sessions, the reality of what had happened, of what could have happened, was unavoidable. Rachel might have been fired, but the culture that had enabled her wasn't going to change overnight. That was the real battle. The board, under Vanessa's leadership, approved a full-scale review of hiring practices, promotion paths, and disciplinary measures to ensure that employees weren't just being trained to recognize bias, they were being held accountable for it. Complaints about discrimination that once got lost in a sea of HR bureaucracy were now being tracked and investigated with real consequences. Skylink also implemented a passenger accountability review, eliminating the so-called unspoken vetting process that had led to Elijah being flagged before he had even stepped up to the counter. The list, once hidden in confidential emails, was now permanently erased. But perhaps the most significant move was the public apology. It wasn't just a polished statement carefully crafted to control the damage. Vanessa Brooks stood in front of cameras, looked directly into them, and acknowledged everything. She admitted the company's failure. She didn't blame rogue employees. She didn't hide behind legal terminology. She owned it. What happened to Mr. Carter was not an isolated incident, she said, her voice steady, unflinching. It was a symptom of a deeper issue within this company, an issue that we are committed to fixing, not through words but through action. Effective immediately, we are implementing sweeping changes to ensure that no passenger, no business partner, no human being is ever made to feel like they don't belong in one of our terminals. Her speech aired on national television. It was clipped, shared, and dissected across social media. Some were still skeptical. People had heard corporate apologies before, only to see nothing change. But as weeks passed and reports from inside the company confirmed that real changes were happening, attitudes began to shift. Elijah watched it all unfold from a distance. He wasn't interested in being the face of Skylink's redemption story. This wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, progress was possible. Elijah stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of pressurized air and faint traces of coffee lingering in the cabin. He moved with quiet confidence, his steps steady as he made his way down the aisle toward his seat in first class. The hum of conversation surrounded him, passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants moving efficiently through pre-departure checks. It felt like any other flight, any other day. But then, as he placed his carry-on in the overhead bin and took his seat by the window, he felt a presence beside him. A man, mid-40s, sharp navy blazer, the kind of professional polish that suggested he had spent years navigating boardrooms, was watching him. Not with skepticism, not with hostility, but with recognition. "You're Elijah Carter, right?" the man asked, his voice measured but tinged with something else. "From the video." Elijah exhaled through his nose, offering a small, knowing smile. "I suppose that depends on which video you're talking about." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "The one where you got treated like a damn criminal for no reason and still kept your cool?" He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I saw the whole thing, and I gotta be honest. I'm not sure I would have handled it the way you did." Elijah studied him for a moment, then turned his gaze out the window, watching the airport ground crew move in coordinated motions beneath the wings. He let the silence stretch, choosing his words carefully. "You don't fight fire with fire," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "You fight it with something stronger. Justice." The man nodded, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. "That's a rare kind of strength," he admitted. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. As the plane taxied down the runway, engines roaring to life, he let himself settle into his seat, knowing that this moment, this victory, wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been told they didn't belong. Every time someone had to prove their worth when it should have never been questioned in the first place. The world wasn't fixed, not yet, but today it was a little better than yesterday. How many times does this story have to happen before real change sticks? How many times must a successful black man prove he belongs? And most importantly, what would you have done if you were there? This isn't just a story, it's reality. It's what happens every day in airports, boardrooms, stores, and streets all over the world. The question isn't whether racism still exists, it's whether we're willing to do something about it. If this story moved you, share it. Speak up when you see injustice. Change starts with conversations, but it doesn't end there. Because respect should never be a privilege. It should be the standard. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself or someone else in a moment where it mattered? What's your story of standing up against discrimination? Share it in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your experiences matter. These conversations aren't just about awareness. They're about action. Every story shared is another step toward real change. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage, resilience, and justice. The more we talk about these issues, the harder they become to ignore. Together, we can create a world where respect isn't conditional, where dignity isn't something to be fought for, but something that's recognized and upheld for everyone. Let's keep pushing forward, let's keep speaking up, because change starts with us.